Thank you. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this talk on challenging legacies, cataloguing and metadata, and the British Library Race Equality Action Plan. I'm Victoria Parkinson. I am the chair of the ARLIS Cataloguing and Classification Committee. And today's event is organised by us as part of a series of talks we're hosting on cataloguing and classification ethics. Huge thanks to the other members of the committee for organising this talk. At the end of the presentation, there'll be time for questions, so do put them in the chat as you go, and Annalisa will handle them at the end. Let's get going, and I'm going to hand over to my fellow committee member, Annalisa, to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Victoria. Good morning, all, and welcome back to the third appointment with our series, Cataloguing and Classification Ethics. I should very briefly introduce myself. My name is Annalisa Ricciardi. I am part of the ARLIS Cataloguing and Classification Committee, and I am a cataloger for the Americas and Oceania Office at the British Library. Today's talk, by the title Challenging Legacies, Cataloguing, Metadata, and the British Library Race Equality Action Plan, will be given by Alan Danskin. Alan is the Collection Metadata Standards Manager at the British Library. He is responsible for metadata quality and the library's contribution to development, implementation, and application of bibliographic standards. He was a member of the Cataloguing and Metadata Subgroup of the Anti-Racism Project at the British Library. Alan is our main point of reference for cataloging projects that could present problematic structures. He has provided advice on cataloging emerging formats, on changing, adding, or removing in bulk subject headings, and on adding appropriate tags to large groups of items or collection. And he knows much more, but what he probably doesn't know is that he's known as the metadata guru among many of us. This presentation is an overview of the ongoing work of the British Library to deliver the cataloging and metadata actions published in its Race Equality Action Plan. The presentation will examine the recommendations made by the anti-racism projects within the Cataloguing and Metadata subgroup, with the aim of reviewing the language used in metadata descriptions, addressing inappropriate and outdated terminology, improving access to under-described or undiscoverable collections, and embedding ethical principles throughout our workflows through focused training and best practice guidance. And I should now give the floor to you, Alan, and just a reminder that there would be space for questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Annalisa. I'll share my screen now. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you this afternoon. Yes, I chose the title Challenging Legacies because the library's metadata and its catalogues go back many, many years, and it's the content of its collections even longer. And times have changed, and the language changes over time. So we need to look at how we adapt to these things. And that's really what the focus of this presentation is about. So I expect everyone on the call knows this, but just for clarification, metadata is essentially structured data about data. Library catalogues are one kind of metadata. And we have library catalogues in order to enable access to our collections, to enable people to research, to inspire people, and for enjoyment. Importantly, our metadata should not create a barrier to access for any of our users. So what I'm going to cover this afternoon, I have a brief look at last year's project on anti-racism, and then I'll talk about the Race Equality Action Plan, and then I'll look in a bit more detail at our planning for implementation and the objectives that we've set. There's a few words about benchmarking, and there are links at the end to any of the things that I've referenced in the presentation. And as Annalisa said, there will be time for questions at the end. So the anti-racism project at the British Library was established in 2020. It was designed to be a bottom-up, staff-led project. Several subgroups were established covering audiences, behaviour and values and experiences, cataloguing and metadata, collections and content, data research and insights, people and HR policy. But there was also a subgroup for the group leaders, or the subgroup leaders and coordinators, where they could get together to coordinate what they were doing. So these subgroups really covered the whole range of activity in the library. At least that was the intention. And as Liz Jolly has said, the recommendations from the project in terms of immediate actions and longer term proposals to be integrated into our strategy will make the library an anti-racist organisation in a wide-ranging and sustainable way. So I'm going to focus on the cataloguing and metadata subgroup today because we're primarily here to talk about cataloguing and metadata. So when we convened, which was really at the end of December 2020, we set ourselves a purpose or terms of reference. We wanted to understand and expose the extent and impact of discrimination and bias in our cataloguing practices and metadata. We wanted to facilitate the development and enhancement of descriptions, interpretations, and presentations of collection items. And in order to do that, we have to collaborate with colleagues involved in those areas, both within the library and also to learn from best practice beyond the library in order to make recommendations to enhance inclusivity and accessibility of the library's collections for potential users. So from that work, which was conducted from January 2020 really through to the end of September 2020, three broad objectives were defined to try to reduce barriers to access, and those related to metadata, access and discovery, and policy and principles. And 10 recommendations were submitted by the Cataloguing and Metadata subgroup to the project as a whole at the end of September. And as you'll see, those have been incorporated into the Race Equality Action Plan. Importantly, the group also made the case for resourcing. None of this activity is possible without adequate resourcing. It's important that we communicate the centrality of cataloguing and metadata to the production of knowledge and to the presentation of cultural heritage for our diverse communities. And it's also important that we have greater resource to enable cataloguing and metadata teams to provide the infrastructure necessary. So, the Race Equality Action Plan, I've included a link at the end of the talk to the Race Equality Action Plan. It's a 3-year project with the intention of delivering institutional change across the library. The outcomes from the cataloguing and metadata subgroup have been incorporated into the plan, and the plan itself was published in January of this year. So the first of the main actions or themes, if you like, is metadata. And one of the key activities is to establish a comprehensive glossary of inclusive terminology to support a multifaceted collections audit. I'll say more about that shortly. We also aim to create a flexible approach for treating problematic terminology to ensure that descriptions are contextualized and accurate, and that ensures that users are able to experience the catalogue and website, and provides warning where necessary of potential for discriminatory and harmful content. We will develop more flexible subject terminologies. This is the second action for access and discovery. We have to develop more flexible subject terminologies and discovery approaches. We aim to bypass or supersede outdated and inappropriate language. We also want to surface underdescribed and undiscoverable collections. Underdescribed collections may be collections where the metadata is inadequate in some way. Either it doesn't identify the collection sufficiently, particularly to the range of audiences that might be interested in it, or it may not describe exactly how the collection was acquired by the library. And we also have collections that are awaiting cataloguing, and we want to look at how we prioritize those for cataloguing and whether there's any hidden biases in those decisions. And we will respect access protocols to culturally sensitive heritage, and I'll say a little bit more about that later on. We want to improve discovery of marginalized experiences in the collection through the creation of collection guides, finding aids, blogs, social media, as well as increased targeted and fuller cataloguing. The library contains a great wealth of information for all communities, but sometimes it can be difficult to find it. And so we want to improve access in that way. The third point was policy and principles, and this is really at the heart of cultural and institutional change. We are going to, well, we already have ethical principles that underpin our cataloguing metadata, but we're going to develop those ethical principles for cataloguing metadata. And we're going to also provide training and support for staff who are having to work on material that may be sensitive. As I said, the library is a very diverse collection, and we have sound collections, video collections, image collections, some of which deal with difficult topics and include difficult images and language that people may find offensive. And it's important that staff who are working on those collections do have the appropriate support. We also want to, and that users, of course, receive appropriate warning of the nature of the collection. We also will provide staff with regular training on best practice, as we do with other types of training, to keep people up to date. So those are the broad actions that we have to discharge in relation to the cataloguing and metadata. And those were broken down into a number of objectives, or these are taken directly from the recommendations made by the Cataloguing and Metadata Subgroup, which have subsequently been prioritized. I'm not expecting that everyone will be able to read the small print here. I think it's sufficient to see that of the 10 objectives, almost all of them have high impact and high priority. And so we've been looking at the ways in which we can implement this set of activities and deliver on these objectives. And so, and I should say that those 10 objectives, of course, are only for cataloguing metadata. There are many other objectives or recommendations that are being taken forward by the other subgroups across the library, one of which is the collections and curation group, with whom we are planning a pilot project as a proof of concept. The idea is to develop an end-to-end project that will deliver sustainable workflows for equitable and inclusive collection description and discovery, in the course of which we will be able to review the language used in metadata and interpretation for some chosen collections, develop our glossary of potentially offensive terms and contextual guidance, and provide inclusive alternatives. There will be a methodology for auditing Indigenous cultural heritage and culturally sensitive material, and to research provenance within the scope of the project. And we aim to develop and publish guidance for library users and training for staff. More on the collections side, I should mention that there will be collaboration with community groups around co-collection, so sharing responsibility for collecting material, and perhaps providing a sort of resort for those communities if their collections are endangered in any way. We will be experimenting with external advisors. This pilot project gives us an opportunity to try things out and to find out what works, and fundamentally to set out workflows that can then be sustained after the end of the project. We've been looking at the resources needed, and so we will be looking to fill some new posts around the metadata, someone to lead the metadata work and someone to assist them. And there's also likely to be a curatorial role. Those posts are being discussed now within the project itself. And the project will, of course, receive support from other staff within the library. From my own area, I will be allocating time from one of my collection metadata analysts to support the project. And there will also be resource from my quality assurance team, who are mainly catalogers. And there will be support from curators as well. And that will depend to some extent on the project, on the collections that are selected for the focus of the pilot project. So if we look in a little bit more detail at some of the objectives that we have. So I think underpinning everything that we plan to do is this idea of establishing a comprehensive glossary of problematic and inclusive terminology as a reference for cataloguing of culturally sensitive material. And what I've put on the screen is an extract from Inclusive Terminology Guide and Glossary for the Cultural Heritage Sector, which was developed by Carissa Chu, who was working at the National Library of Scotland at that time. And it was published in May 2021 and continues to be developed. So as you can see in the illustration, hopefully, in the left hand, the blue column, we have a potentially offensive term or phrase. In the adjacent column, it gives some historical context for how that term has been used. and then it suggests some preferred terms or phrases. It also provides information about equivalent terms that are currently used in Library of Congress subject headings, for example. So what we will aim to do is use this as a tool to identify within our catalogues and content catalogue descriptions or collection items or web pages, anything where terms are used which may cause offence, and we can then use the contextual information to decide, whether it does cause offence or is likely to, and we can then decide what kind of remedial action might be required. We will, in the course of this work, particularly of the pilot project, we will also develop the glossary. The glossary is a very good tool, but it's by no means comprehensive, and we expect to find other terms that we would want to add either to the existing entries or to create new entries. The second action is to establish a multifaceted approach to auditing the collections for racist descriptions through a number of resourced projects and also business as usual work in cataloguing and curation teams. So the scale of this task is quite daunting. The collection's over 170 million items, and we have many more catalogue records, I think. So it's a huge undertaking. We can't expect to complete it within the time frame for the Race Equality Action Plan, which is a 3-year project, as I mentioned. So that's to some extent why we framed our activity as a proof of concept project, as a pilot. So we're going to select representative collections. That work's currently underway. We're going to apply appropriate methodologies for auditing, the various methodologies that could be used. We'll look at what's appropriate to the collections that we select. And then we will develop sustainable workflows, which certainly sounds like quite easy when you say it quickly like that. Now, the selection criteria that we're working on, obviously the library's collection is huge, as I've just said. It's very diverse, and we need the pilot project to be representative. And so we set some selection criteria out to try and cover the main, or I suppose uncover the main issues that we would have to deal with throughout the pilot project. So we have 3 main cataloguing systems: the ALIF library management system, which is for published material, the in-house IAMS system, which is for the integrated archives and manuscripts. So that's an integrated archives and manuscript system. And we also have the SAMI system, which is for sound and moving image. And that's actually a subsidiary system. We aim to include different content and media types in this. As you can realize from the different systems involved, we will obviously have published material, unpublished material, textual material, sound and vision, and still images as well, hopefully. And we're trying to cover as much as possible. We want the collections to be relevant to communities in the UK, but also to be of significance to countries overseas. It's important that we include a range of languages and scripts. We will, as I said, be building on the existing glossary throughout this project. So ideally, we want the collections that we choose to have some foundation in the terms that are already in the glossary, but to be capable of adding to them. And we're also looking at collections that will, on the whole, have clear provenance, but should contain items whose provenance needs to be researched and articulated. We also want to have a collection that's large enough to be meaningful, but not so large that it becomes impractical. Because it needs to be achievable within the time frame for the project. The next objective is to establish a flexible schema for treating problematic terminology, and to consider terms in context and not inhibit accurate identification of items. So again, this will be built on the work that Carissa Chu has done at National Library of Scotland in the glossary, but supplemented by the work that we're doing within the pilot project. What we're aiming to do is produce something that can be machine actionable so that we can apply automatically to descriptions. We want to explore ways in which we can obviously use machine learning tools and computational methods to the catalogue in order to identify records, and then include appropriate advisories, which I'll come to in a moment. So I've included an example here of the kind of entry that you can see in Carissa's glossary. So the term slave or slaves is one that people of African and Caribbean heritage in particular find distressing. And the glossary tells us that referring to a person as a slave normalizes the category slave as an inherent identity of a person, thus ignoring that this identity was created by someone else through violent force. And so the term that's recommended to be used in our cataloguing is enslaved persons, which obviously makes it clear that this is something that's been done to the person rather than something that the person is. So this is what is meant by considering terms in context, but not obscuring, if you like, the semantics of what is meant. Move on to the next slide. So the fourth objective is to implement guidance by which users are made aware of terms or images in the library's content or metadata that may cause offence or distress. This is really one of the major outcomes or outputs from the project, that the work that we do will result in guidance or advisories on our website and in our metadata and our discovery systems. So these kind of advisories do already exist, but there is no real consistency, no corporate approach to this. And so this is so the nature of what we're trying to do is to provide people with clear guidance on how to approach these things, the kind of language to use in the advisories, what kind of advisories might be appropriate in specific contexts. You can see an example at the top right of an advisory that was that you can actually see on the True Echoes project website. True Echoes was a project that the library did, or is currently still engaged in fact, in collaboration with communities in the South Pacific, including the Torres Island, which are mentioned in this particular advisory. So that's a very specific kind of advisory. The example below it is just a draft or an example that was provided by the Cataloguing and Metadata subgroup to illustrate the kind of thing that other institutions are providing for their users, and that the library could adapt to its own needs. So we had proposed 3 essential levels at which advisories might be needed. There's a top level, which is the sort of very general advisory, which would be supported by a contextual document giving some background onto why libraries' content and metadata may contain contemporary audiences find at best surprising and at worst offensive. And there will also be potentially specific collections where there may be guidance may be required. And so that guidance would be provided in the collection guide and possibly in other metadata. And then if we get down to the item level, specific items may contain offensive language. They may be images that are distressing. And so again, it would be appropriate to alert people to the fact, just in the way that television programs will have an announcement in advance to say that you may find some of the images or content of this program distressing. So the content guidance steering group is just beginning to look at some principles and strategy to underpin this kind of content guidance. And we're going to be making recommendations on that probably by September. There are obviously some questions that we've got to consider. We're looking at, how do these affect not only things that the library puts on its own website, how does it affect library content that is being used by third parties, or library metadata that's being used by third parties? What guidance should we give to people that we're working with in collaborations, or who are licensing our content or our metadata? We obviously provide licenses that cover reuse of metadata, and perhaps we need to have some development of that kind of relationship or that kind of documentation to cover appropriate or the inclusion of advisories. So these are things that we're thinking about. Obviously, we're dealing with different audiences within the library, and we have a public website, and sometimes the content of our recordings, for example, may contain language that wouldn't normally be considered appropriate to put on a public website without a warning. There are questions about whether certain types of content should be redacted for that public sphere, but still, obviously, just in terms of an access copy, but in terms of the original, there would be no intention of changing anything. The originals will remain as they were. And there's also questions about our metadata. Should the metadata be changed, or should and if it is changed, should the previous versions of the metadata be retained? There are different views on this, and to some extent, the outcomes will depend on technical capabilities. At the moment, we can't. We have no capability to retain all of the edits made in ARLIS, for example. But in future, when we replace our systems, perhaps that should be a requirement, so that the history of the catalogue, if you like, and it's the way in which it's changed by society's perceptions and is recorded. Historically, of course, we would have published it in print and we would have had that record. But of course, nowadays, it's all digital and it changes daily. The fifth recommendation, or sorry, the fifth objective is to develop more flexible subject approaches. So subject indexing, as probably most of you know, is quite an expensive element of collection, description, or cataloging. So to manage that cost and to distribute the effort of supporting these vocabularies, we work in collaboration with other communities, the Library of Congress, the Programme for Cooperative Cataloguing, and so forth. So those large, and Dewey Decimal, of course. So we essentially use vocabularies that are created by third parties. And those are large, general vocabularies, but often very detailed as well. But one size does not fit all. When we first decided to adopt Library of Congress subject headings, we were aware that it had a strong American bias in its terminology, and in some cases in the underlying semantics of terms. And some of the terms would not satisfy our users. We balanced that against the cost of trying to maintain our own vocabulary, and we just couldn't resource our own vocabulary. So we went with Library of Congress subject headings, but it's clear that one size does not fit all. Society is changing, people's expectations are changing, and new technology does give us more flexibility. Historically, we've been kind of straitjacketed into requiring a preferred term that identifies a concept, and then there are hopefully alternative terms that can be used to also to point people at a preferred term. But if that preferred term is a term that is now gone out of vogue or has become offensive or distressing in some way, we really need to provide an alternative to it. And the pace of change in those large vocabularies can be quite slow, as people will be aware of from recent attempts to amend LCSH. And those attempts are not always successful, or it takes a great deal of time for them to come to fruition. But even to put new terms through to Library of Congress is quite a laborious process. So we're looking at how can we use technology to get around this. Linked data gives us the potential to link to alternative vocabularies, which we can then use to supplement these more general vocabularies. So vocabularies that are specific to particular communities, or vocabularies that relate to particular cultural heritage. So we can supplement or we can replace existing terms. These again are things that we're going to develop in the course of this activity. And this will be one of the most challenging parts of the work, I think, because it's quite complex working around terms within our discovery layer, and to provide alternative vocabularies that people can use, and to train catalogers to apply them. It is, an overhead which we have to evaluate and see how we can most efficiently deliver it. And I suppose the final perhaps the most important of the activities is to ensure that everyone involved in the activity of cataloguing understands the principles behind equity and diversity and inclusion. And so the Cataloguing Metadata Task Group looked at guidance from various professional bodies that include the International Federation of Library Association, the International Council on Archives, the SOLIP, and the Museums Association. We also looked at the work being done by the Cataloguing Ethics Steering Committee, and we took guidelines from those and started mapping them onto the library's own values. The library has a set of value statements to which staff were expected to subscribe. And so we tried to map those on in order to help people turn principles into actions and behaviours. Often these ethical principles are very high level, and it's hard to necessarily tie them into your day-to-day work. So that's what we've been trying to do, is to provide practical examples of good practice. And the intention is that we will then be able to embed these principles and practices throughout our workflows, whether it's a question of choosing standards or vocabularies, a question of contributing to the development of existing standards, choosing suppliers. Should suppliers be required to provide metadata that satisfies our ethical as well as our economic requirements? Scoping of projects. Maybe projects that we've been engaged in the past could have had a more ethical dimension and taken more account of language and issues of inclusion. And then collection description, which is obviously the main activity of most of our cataloguers, and subject analysis. So trying to embed all of this throughout the workflow. We also have to engage with our audiences, and this is an area where I'm relying very much on our colleagues in collections and curations who are more in touch with our users, particularly researchers interested in our collections. And so we aim to create more accessible and transparent feedback process to encourage users to report harmful material. Now, we already have some feedback processes. You can comment on, you can request changes to catalogue records by filling in a form on our catalogue. But there's no consistent corporate approach to this. And so we need better signposting and hopefully a single gateway whereby people can approach the library with information and requests. And we need to be encouraging people rather than, so it's giving people the encouragement to do this rather than just providing them a way in which they could do it if they found the appropriate page. So also we need to develop processes to enable continuous collaboration with stakeholder communities. And the pilot project is intended to include engagement with stakeholders. We have existing relationships and we aim to create some new ones. We have to serve all our audiences. But it's important to remember that often people in stakeholder communities are not just being approached by the library, they're being approached by other people for guidance. And so we have to respect people's time and labour. There are other things in their lives in helping the British Library. And part of the reason for the emphasis on embedding ethical principles is to ensure that staff become aware that this is not just an issue for some people, it's an issue for everyone that works in the library. And we have a collective responsibility to serve our audiences, whoever they are. We also need to improve some aspects of how we can search for the collections. We did carry out a substantial project to look at language coverage in our content and identified 4 million items that didn't have any language content in the metadata, and we've actually, it turned out to be 5 million in the end, and we've actually added language codes to all 5 million, or pretty much all 5 million of them. But that project also identified the fact that there are quite a lot of languages that are identified by collective codes that don't identify individual languages, they identify regional or geographic groups of languages. And so we want to improve on that and use other standards to identify languages more specifically. And we also need to improve the use of original script in our catalogue so that people can read things in their own script. Nobody actually understands transliteration apart from catalogers. And we're also going to be working with Indigenous communities and experts to establish appropriate access and description protocols for material of relevance to Indigenous cultural heritage. And we're looking at true echoes and the care principles as ways of doing that. True echoes is a good exemplar. The care principles for Indigenous data governance provide us with some additional guidance on an approach that we could follow. I'm conscious of time, I want to leave some time for questions. So just to alert people, if you're not aware, to this paper from OCLC on reimagining descriptive workflows. It's a really useful document, which I've been reading. They've set out a number of, they've set out a framework of guidance which looks at organizational, operational, and professional development. So I'm thinking of using it as a kind of benchmarking approach to our work. And so I've been kind of mapping our objectives against their categorization. So it looks like we covered most things. And obviously that can continue to be assessed as we go through the project. So just to conclude, the purpose of the catalogue is to make public collections more accessible for those who want to use them for research, inspiration, or enjoyment. What I've described are the early stages of a programme with the object of removing barriers to access. I've only talked about cataloguing, metadata, and collections. Work on the other aspects is proceeding in parallel, and with the metadata work described here. So thank you for listening, and I will. There are some links at the end here to different things that I've mentioned, and I think we have time for some questions now. I'll stop.